Hey, crime fighters and true crime junkies, this is Derek Judd, the Cowboy Criminologist with Cowboy Criminology. So, as promised, first installment of Serial Killer Saturdays. It was interesting. So, the poll got 3 votes, but, it's a growing channel, so what do you expect? So, I just decided to go in order of when the votes came in. So, the first one that got voted for, the first serial killer that got voted for, was Richard Cottingham. Okay. Richard Cottingham is interesting. And a lot of true crime channels, they like to do Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez, some of those guys. And they're interesting to talk about. But they're interesting for very different reasons. And I think maybe next week, maybe the week after, I'm going to try and just kind of sum up why I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about them. Richard Cottingham, very, very interesting case. And the reason he's so interesting is because as a serial killer, he's completely atypical. Not really in how he killed or his modus operandi or his signature, but he didn't have the normal childhood upbringing that you'd expect. Okay. So he was born in New York, November 25th, 1946, to a good Catholic family. Father was president of Metropolitan Life in New York, had been there for a number of years. Another interesting thing is in a case like Richard Cottingham, you often hear people try to say, well, when they look at the victims, they're like, this is done by a madman, somebody who hates women, despises women, distrusts women, hates his mother. No, that's actually very rarely the case. And it's actually not helpful to the investigation. And so when you hear people say that, you can automatically just kind of throw it away because it's garbage. It's an opinion based on stereotypical and anecdotal evidence, and is generally not even useful in the crime that you're looking at. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this. So he didn't grow up in poverty. He didn't grow up. He didn't grow up poor. He didn't really face any kind of adversity, except for the fact that he was overweight and wore glasses, and he was very socially awkward. Had a real hard time making friends. Okay. Oddly enough, getting back to the hating women, there's actually nothing in Richard Cottingham's past about being abused by his mother or thinking she was unworthy as a woman, or that she had or she wasn't womanly. If you look at a lot of serial killers, their relationship with their mother kind of tells you a lot. Either they're really, really attached to their mother in like the super creepiest kind of way, or they resent their mother because of the actions they do. Maybe they engage in prostitution. Maybe they're incredibly promiscuous. Who knows? I mean, there's it runs the gauntlet. So the really scary ones, and Richard Cottingham doesn't fall into this, but I'm just saying this for future reference. The real scary ones are the ones who put their mothers on a pedestal and kind of worship their mother, and basically you'll never meet that standard. You will never be the woman that my mother was. And those guys get out there. All right. So let's go into part 1. Killer instincts are awakened. Okay. So, the Cottingham family moved to Rivervale, New Jersey in 1956. Okay. That puts him about 9-10 years old. And according to Richard Cottingham, this is where he became exposed to bondage pornography. Okay. So here's kind of the interesting thing. I just said that he was overweight, he wore glasses, socially awkward, not very popular, had a hard time making friends. So he probably spent a lot of time walking the neighborhood alone, uh, spending time by himself. Probably had something of a fantasy life, but not like you would think a lot of serial killers have, like thinking about doing violence to people or anything like that. His was probably a lot more simple. He probably spent most of his time thinking about how things work. Okay, um, I'll get to that. I'll get to that because I'm gonna make a connection here that I think might surprise you. Okay, so he looked at his first experience with pornography was bondage pornography. Okay, given that this is 1956, I question bondage pornography. Okay, what is meant by that? What I think he actually found was a True Detective magazine. And True Detective magazines are kind of the evolution of uh, broadsides and penny dreadfuls. True Detective magazines, they're they're interesting. They feature real cases. They talk about police procedure, police policies. You know how criminals got away with certain crimes in very vivid detail. Okay, Dr. Park Dietz, who helped Dan Burgess, uh, John Douglas, Robert Ressler write the crime classification manual. In the behavioral study that they did, one of the questions that they asked was, "What type of things do you enjoy reading? What kind of magazines do you collect? What kind of books do you collect? Photographs, pictures, and things like that." And a shockingly high rate of the people that they interviewed collected True Detective magazines. Why? Well, first off, not as offensive as what we would consider pornography. Um, but the covers almost always featured a beautiful woman on the cover being terrorized by some figure that you couldn't see. But if you follow your eye line, you could tell where the individual was supposed to be. So I think this is the bondage pornography that people are talking about, or Richard Cottingham was talking about. I think it was actually a True Detective magazine that showed a woman in bondage. Now, given the time, given the location, I think this might have been the magazine that he was looking at. Now, True Detective magazines are kind of a broad term, like Band Aid. Band Aid is a brand name of bandages. Well, True Detective magazines is an actual title of detective magazines. Happen to be one of the most popular ones out there. And so, if it wasn't this one, I would be willing to bet it's something very similar. And the descriptions of what happened to the victims in these rapes, kidnaps, murders, and things like that, go on in very graphic detail. Now, you think about the psychosexual development of a 9 or 10-year-old, okay? 9 or 10-year-old finds this, and if they're socially adjusted and stuff like that, they may look at it and it might be something taboo, but they don't really think about it. They mostly look at it and be like, "Oh, that's really gross." But if you're an incredible introvert, you have no friends, you have nobody to talk to, you have nobody to keep you grounded, you may look at that and your love map takes a detour. And instead of looking at how to approach people and become friends, he learns something different. He learns how to manipulate, dominate, and control so that he can take what he wants. Okay. Um, very these things have been kicked around quite a bit. How much influence do they actually have on violent offenders is unknown. Um, One of the things I'll dismiss right off the bat is it's not the pornography, it's not the True Detective magazines, it's not the books, it's not the music, it's not the movies. The thought is already in their head. If they're going to do evil, they're going to do evil. There's no way around it. Now, are they influenced something by what they see? Do they start to use that to kind of develop their own MO and signature? Absolutely. Absolutely. But as far as being the underlying cause, who knows? Now, high school did get better for Richard Cottingham. He joined the track team, started making some friends, but he still always kind of stayed on the periphery of everything else. Now, I think it's interesting that Cottingham's victims were all very good-looking women, uh, teenage girls, women. But he also, but the women he targeted. If you look at a serial killer like Ted Bundy, and you look at his victims, they're all gorgeous. But you can look at those girls, and you could, if you didn't know anything about them, you didn't know anything about Ted Bundy, and you saw pictures of them side by side, you could think, okay, they could have been high school, college sweethearts. They look like they belong together. But you look at Cottingham's victims, and that's just not the case. Like there's nothing really intriguing about him that would draw women of that caliber to him. Okay. So he graduated in 1964, got his first job working in the mailroom for MetLife, where his dad is the president. Not uncommon at the time. That was a time in American society where you started in the mailroom and you retired as president of the company or a high-ranking vice president or something like that. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen now. Those jobs go to well-connected college graduates who have no concept of the real world. And if you want case in point, look how Las Vegas casinos are run by MBAs and stuff like that, as opposed to, oh, I don't know, the mob, because they understood doing a volume business. You keep your prices low, you keep people coming back, they keep putting money on the tables, they keep putting money in the machines. And now that's just not the case. But that's neither here nor there. Now, I said that Richard Cottingham was probably an introvert because he spent so much time alone. So it shouldn't be a surprise that he was drawn to a profession, a new profession coming out of computers. And so he took some classes, found out he had a real aptitude for computers, and became the mainframe operator for Metropolitan Life. And he did that for 2 years till 1966, and then he went over to Blue Cross Blue Shield, and he was there for 24 years, 1980, when he finally got busted. Because of the meticulous nature of operating computers on a large scale, if I was talking to Richard Cottingham, not knowing anything about his life before this, if I was asking about his childhood, I would almost bet, I would almost be willing to bet that he was involved with computers somehow. Software engineer, IT, something like that. Why? Introverted people are drawn to that. People with a meticulous nature are drawn to that. We know that Richard Cottingham was a very organized offender, and I'll get into a little bit more about that. But everything he did had a process. Everything he did was for a reason. Nothing was by accident. So it's interesting, but it's not really surprising that he would choose kind of an IT kind of field dealing with computers. Now, you may think that might be a little bit of a stretch, and okay, maybe a little bit. I'm not saying it's a hard fast rule. You know, you're not going to set your watch by it. But the next time the IT guys are around, you're going to find two types. Okay. The first type is that very outgoing, fun to be around guy who likes to kind of razz people about not being as technologically sophisticated as he is. Okay. The guy's funny, he's amiable, he's fun to be around. You always like it when he comes by. And then there's the second type. And the second type is very awkward. If you try and talk with him, try and laugh with him, try and joke with him, he's kind of like really nervous, like doesn't really know how to function around people. He just wants to be left alone with his machines. Okay. I would be willing to bet that Cottingham kind of moved towards that bent. Okay. In conversations with his fellow coworkers, Cottingham was always very boastful in that group, made a lot of inappropriate jokes, made people really uncomfortable. And that's that introverted, socially awkward thing. We're going to get to more of that. Now, interesting coincidence. Rodney Alcala was living in New York, working for Blue Cross Blue Shield at the same time that Richard Cottingham was working there. Now, neither one of them claimed to have ever met each other, had a run-in with each other, but it's just odd that Rodney Alcala, David Berkowitz, and who are we doing the video about? Richard Cottingham. Were actually all in the same region at the exact same time. Okay. And so it's, when you find those intersections between serial killers, it's really hard not to look for some type of connection, some type of, how did this happen? And generally it really is the most innocent of coincidences, but you've got to wonder, right? You've got to wonder. All right, y'all, welcome back for part 2. Okay, so part 2, True Detectives, is Robert Anzalotti and Jennifer Weiss. Now, Jennifer Weiss is, they're both very interesting to the Cottingham case. Okay, now I'm doing this a little different. One of the things I absolutely hate when I watch a true crime documentary is the Quentin Tarantino-esque way that they lay out the story. They start at the end, they go back to the middle, they go back to the end, they come to the beginning, and it's very, very hard to keep a chronological order, okay? So Richard Cottingham stated that he first began killing in his adolescence. Adolescence is a broad term, and depending on what your definition of adolescence is that 13 to 18? Is that, I don't know, 15 to 20? It's a really ambiguous term. But Anzalotti was a cold case investigator for a district attorney's office up in New Jersey, excuse me. And after he was looking at some of the cold cases and everything, he started to notice a pattern. And it was a pattern that seemed to fit Richard Cottingham almost exclusively. So they began talking, they kind of formed this relationship, and Richard Cottingham started doling out little bits of information. Interesting thing that Richard Cottingham negotiated, which is a little suspicious, and I'll let you make your mind up about it, but I'll tell you my concerns. You have somebody who's never getting out. All right. Never, 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 ever, 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 ever getting out. Okay. New Jersey's not a death penalty state. So anything they add on to his sentence, human lifespan is about 80 years. Human lifespan is right around 80 years. Um, you know, he's got over 900 years on the books as it is right now. He's not going anywhere. All right. But when you have a killer like this who has absolutely nothing to lose, it always reminds me of Henry Lee Lucas, and he was known as the confession killer because he was treated like royalty. He got to eat well, he got to travel, he got to go to all these different places, and oh yeah, I killed her over here, and oh yeah, well, me and Otis Toole, we did whatever we did over here. And so many investigators flocked to Texas to talk to him, to try and close cases, and with good intention, trying to bring closure to families. Unfortunately, I know this might be the shock of the week for you, so try and hang on. Criminals lie. Convicted felons lie. As a police officer, I can tell you this for a fact. As a police officer and correctional officer, I can tell you this for a fact. One of the things that always tipped me off when somebody was lying is when they tell me, "Officer, I have no reason to lie to you." And I would automatically go, "Well, I stopped you for speeding. You have no insurance. Your registration is expired. You're driving on a suspended license. No, you're right. You have absolutely no reason to lie to me with everything I could take you to jail for right now. You're absolutely right." In the prison system, the exact same thing. "I wouldn't lie to you. I've got no reason to lie to you." Well, yeah, you do. You just told me 30 seconds ago that if you catch a case right now, your parole is set off for another, 3 to 6 months. You have every reason in the world to lie to me. So, anyway, my rant aside. So whenever I hear about somebody who's got nothing to gain in confessing, it always makes my antenna go up. Now, Robert Ancelotti did a fantastic job in his cold case investigations and really vetting the facts that were the facts and evidence collected by the original investigator and comparing that with statements by Richard Cottingham to close these cases. And the first case that they can go back and say that 100% without a doubt Richard Cottingham committed was the Marianne Sala killing. She was strangled, no sexual assault. She was a shop clerk at a place where 20-year-old Richard Cottingham happened to frequent. Now, let me explain something right here. This is unusual behavior for a budding serial killer, okay? I take that back. It is and it isn't. What's unusual about it is that most of his victims were low-risk victims, meaning they didn't engage in a high-risk lifestyle for the most part. But then you have this interesting thing that when you're talking to most death investigators and most criminologists, they will tell you that the first killing is the most important. If I had to take a guess, looking at the photo array of all of Richard Cottingham's 16 plus victims, I would have to say that I think Richard Cottingham never got over being rejected by a certain type of girl in high school. The preppy cheerleader, the popular girl, the girl that was always out of his reach. And so I think that kind of became a target for him. But aside from the fact that Richard Cottingham used to frequent the store that Miss Sala worked at, there's no other real connection. So I think a lot of Richard Cottingham's victims were surrogates and stand-ins for a real person, somebody who he perceived had wronged him, slighted him in such a way that he never got over it. Okay. So that puts his first confirmed murder at 20 years old. Okay. So now, that's January 24, October 28th, 1967, Richfield Park kidnaps an acquaintance of his. And her name is Nancy Vogel, 29, mother of two, married, going to a church to play bingo, driving her own vehicle. Y'all, there is very little, if any, high risk behavior there. Well, I'm going to call it what it is. There's no high risk behavior there. Okay. Now, Cottingham was an acquaintance of hers, not really a friend, but somebody known. And this is where it gets interesting. How Cottingham managed to stay off of everybody's radar, because there would have been behaviors about him. Maybe somebody who paid Ms. Vogel extra attention, somebody who made comments to her that bordered on the inappropriate, but never really pushed that line, but just kind of made her keep her guard up. Okay. So there's not a whole lot known about how he was able to kidnap her, if he waited for her outside of her vehicle, what it was. But they found her strangled. And the first two victims showed no sign of sexual assault, which would fit with the progression. Okay. A lot of times, serial killers, when they're first starting off, they're trying to figure out what works best for them, what they like, what they don't like. Okay. The bondage pornography that we talked about earlier is very, very important, because Cottingham is working out a fantasy. And so he needs women to play into that fantasy, he needs his victims to play into that fantasy, because if they don't, it doesn't do anything for him. Okay. But while he's an organized offender, he's not criminally sophisticated as of yet. And so he's trying to subdue a victim. He's trying to enact his fantasy. He's trying not to get caught. He's trying to do all these things simultaneously. And he ends up killing his victims probably before he's ready. Okay. Now, like I said, these next, all of these ones that I'm talking about at the moment are from Detective Anzalotti, and he got these confessions, was able to confirm it was Cottingham, but he also had a little help from a lady named Jennifer Weiss. Now, Jennifer Weiss fits into this story in the most phenomenal way. So, Jennifer Weiss was the daughter of one of Richard Cottingham's victims, and we'll talk about her in a minute. But Jennifer Weiss has been instrumental in actually establishing a friendship, and she even describes that she thinks of him as a father, and he thinks of her as a daughter, and they have this connection. And on the surface, you might be sitting here saying that is completely creepy. If somebody killed one of my loved ones, the last thing I'm going to do is try and befriend them. And if you're looking for a fight from me, you're not going to get one. But this relationship has bared some interesting fruit. And she's been able to help Detective Anzalotti get Cottingham to open up and talk about some of these cases to try to give closure to other families. And while the relationship is unclear, if there really is a father-daughter dynamic there, and there really is a level of mutual trust and respect, she may be using Richard Cottingham, and I don't mean using in any kind of negative connotation, but using Richard Cottingham as a way to be closer to her mother. And Richard Cottingham might see something in this woman that kind of brings out whatever bit of humanity is inside of him. Okay? So July 17th, 1968, Midland Park, New Jersey, Cottingham kidnaps a 13-year-old girl named Jacqueline Harper. Now, Jacqueline Harper's coming home from school. She's a flag twirler for one of her school programs. Witnesses, well, of course they did. That's what makes them witnesses. Silly. Witnesses observed Cottingham trying to get her into the car. And they saw her become agitated, saw Jackie become agitated, saw her trying to run away, trying to get away. Nobody was able to give law enforcement a description of the vehicle, description of the driver, license plate, anything like that. Here is where the tide starts to change, okay? She was beaten and strangled. She was beaten viciously about the face. Something about that tells me she said something very personal to him that he took umbrage with, and he decided to punish her in a very personal way. Anytime you see an attack about the face, and it's very brutal, it's almost exclusively personal. And then he strangled her with the sling for her flag. Now, investigators were never able to conclusively say whether or not she was sexually assaulted, but they noticed and had enough knowledge of working crime scenes of what a body looks like when the clothes have been disturbed in an inappropriate manner. So something tells me, now this is Richard Cottingham, 68, he would have been 21 years old. Something tells me that at this particular time, he was working towards sexual assault, but he hadn't figured out his MO just yet. He hadn't developed a sense of self-control that comes with being older, more mature. Okay, so if you think about it, if I ask you, what does a serial killer look like? You're probably going to say, well, he's a white male between the ages of 25 and 35. Great. And in countries with a heavy European population, you're going to be right. Holds up in England, Ireland, Scotland, Norway, Sweden, Russia. Okay. It holds up anywhere. Okay. You've got to take population densities and demographics into account when you do that, because otherwise you can be very skewed, you can be very off, and next thing you know, you're looking for a serial killer who doesn't fit the mold. Okay. One of the worst things that ever happened was in criminal profiling was this myth started to come out about the white male serial killer and it being a North American phenomenon. It really wasn't. The FBI was just the first to do the research. They happened to talk to people who just happened to be white males, and that sort of became this myth, that the perpetual myth that wouldn't die, you know. And so you got to be very careful about that, because you have Richard Cottingham right here, who's 5 years younger than most offenders. But that would account for the impulse control, attacking people he knows or he's close to, has some association with. The fact that he had a very specific fantasy in mind, but didn't have enough control over himself or over his victim, and so he had to dispatch her in an absolutely horrific way. However, one thing was very, 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 very clear to him from the start, and that's that strangulation was what he liked the most. He that gave him the biggest sense of control. So, 1969, April 7th, Saddle River, New Jersey, Irene Blaze, 18, is strangled. July 14th, Emerson, New Jersey, Denise Velasca, 15, is strangled. Cottingham was 22 at this time. Abducted these two girls, took them to a hotel room, burned their bodies, threatened, kept one tied up, and threatened to kill the other if they didn't acquiesce to what he wanted. So he tortured them by burning their bodies in various places, and then he drowned them. And then he just left them dumped on the side of the road like garbage. This is Cottingham's first attempt into truly living out his fantasy. 100% complete control over his victims. Now, this is the development of a sexual sadist, okay? When I said that Cottingham has a very specific idea in his head about what he wants his victims to do, what he wants to do to his victims, he had to learn to control himself long enough to get a certain response out of his victims, and also not to kill his victims too quickly. Okay? More on that to come. So, 1970, 22, 23-year-old Richard Cottingham meets Janet. He and Janet fall in love. They get married. 1970 is good. It's looking good for him. Short span. He has 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. Things really seem to be looking up for him. Interesting thing, though. In 1970, it would have been very unusual to have both parents working outside of the home. And if 2 parents had to work, well, one would work during the day, and the other one would work during the evening. Now, if a wife did take a job outside of the home during school hours, generally it was because, well, they were a school teacher, they worked in the school, they worked somewhere that was conducive to dropping the kids off at school and being there to pick them up, look over homework, one thing or another. Cottingham always worked the 3 to 11 shift at Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is not unusual, but it is a little telling, and I'll get to that here in a second. For somebody who has small children at home and a wife who, from what I could tell, didn't have to work, why would he pick that 3 to 11 shift? It's a little bit of a mystery, but I have a theory, so let me share that with you right now. So, if you have to be at work at 3 o'clock, that means you get up at a certain time, probably don't really see your kids off to school, especially if you stay out late. But let's see if we can follow this. So at 3 o'clock, the kids are just getting home. He's going to work. He stays there till 11 o'clock. That leaves the wife making dinner for the kids, making sure they're clean, making sure their homework's done, making sure they have clothes, all of that good stuff. Okay. Basically, he's missing out on a lot of the responsibilities of fatherhood because he's being a provider. At 11 o'clock, the wife's tired. She's going to go to sleep. What does he do? Well, he's staying out till all hours of the night, hanging out with friends, carousing in bars, doing all these things that he really shouldn't be doing. So I have no doubt that several times Janet woke up wanting to know, where in the world is my husband? Why is he not home? And I would imagine, based on Cottingham's nature, I probably said something like this. I didn't want to wake you and the kids, so I went out and stayed out with friends so I could let y'all sleep so I didn't wake you up when I came home. Maybe that excuse flew for a little bit, but what was actually happening was he was using that window of time after work so that he could continue to live the life that he was living. Okay, so I imagine he's probably having affairs, one thing or another. But from 70 to 74, there's no confirmed Richard Cottingham killings. So, oh, I made a mistake. Correct that. So the two girls I mentioned before were not the ones who were burned by Richard Cottingham, the 18-year-old Irene Blaze and Denise Velasca. That was Lorraine Kelly and Mary Pryor, 17 and 16 respectively. Okay, they were kidnapped when they were hitchhiking. Once again, low risk victims, but engaging in high risk behavior. Now, keep in mind, 1974, was kidnapping really considered a high risk thing? Not really. I mean, a lot of people did it. So, with that, with the rape, with the torture, with the burning, the mutilation, the drowning, drowning and suffocation or strangulation generally go hand in hand because it's one of the few forms of homicide where the perpetrator actually gets to feel life leave the victim. Very, very, very scary stuff. Okay. But this is where the Ripper is born. Okay. Now he's gotten the taste for what he likes. So he starts keeping what John Douglas, Roy Hazelwood, and Robert Ressler call a rape kit. And a rape kit is individual to the suspect. But for the most part, it usually contains a mask, some kind of a gag, duct tape, hand restraints, zip ties, a flashlight, probably some tools for burglary or something like that. But that is always kept with them. And y'all, there are too many serial killers out there to mention who practice in this, but they almost exclusively had the same things. Now, Cottingham's got this kit, and his was unique to him because it contained duct tape, handcuffs. It also had his knife. It had rope. It had pistols that weren't real. They looked like real guns, but that was part of a game. Now, remember, I talked about Cottingham's meticulous nature. What is more meticulous than playing a cat and mouse game with somebody that you fully intend to violate and murder, than giving them what looks like an opportunity for them to take you out before you take them out, only to realize at the very last second that what they're holding in their hand is useless. That's some hardcore stuff. So now we move on. 1977, Marianne Carr. She's an X-ray tech, so once again, low risk victim. To me, it's interesting. It wasn't until Cottingham's later progression as a serial killer that he started targeting prostitutes. And I think the most likely possibility for this comes down to eventually he knew that if an officer was able to connect any of these disappearances back to him, and it would look sort of like a spider web, and you'd have Cottingham in the middle, and then you'd have all of his victims, and all of that would come back to him. He would be the common denominator, and you'd have a really hard time answering how all these people around you mysteriously come up missing and then are found dead. Okay? Very difficult to explain. So, Bergen County, New Jersey, Mary Ann Carr, raped, tortured, beaten, fatally strangled. 1978. This is the first of 3 assaults that were so horrific that the officers who found the victims were mortified when the victims were actually able to finally tell them what happened. It was so horrific for them that it was almost unbelievable. So between March 22nd, 23rd, 1978, Karen Schilt, 22, Cottingham attempted to rape her, and when he thought he had rendered her unconscious, he threw her out of the car, left her lying in the gutter. By the way, she was pregnant. She was a waitress, presumably at a place that Cottingham had been to. So he's starting to branch out from people that he knows, but really, really difficult. Now, here's where we get to. I said this is where the Ripper was born. Okay, April 1978. Janet files for divorce on the grounds of abandonment, mental cruelty, refusing to have sex with her after the birth of their 3rd child, staying out until early morning, and leaving her with insufficient funds for the house, inability to pay bills. Okay, so all of this tracks. And one thing that especially tracks is Cottingham had a habit in the office of flashing large stacks of money. Okay, and that money would most likely be used to pay for seedy hotel rooms that he used for sex, buying drinks at the bar. But above all that, he was trying to entice women to come with him. All right. If you're not good looking and you lack social grace, money's the next best thing to looks. So, play your strengths, I guess. So it's interesting and it fills, but why would he stop having sex with her? Most likely reason is that he got a taste of what he wanted to do and what turned him on. And he no longer saw his wife as this sexually desirable being. She was the mother of his children. And mothers don't do the things that he makes his victims do. Okay? So it all really fits, but she started to notice a pattern, and so she filed for divorce. Interestingly enough, when Cottingham is arrested in 1980, she withdraws the divorce. And I think that was a kindness to him, like basically trying to say, hey, you know what? This is one more thing he doesn't need right now, but I want to make sure, if there's any way that he's innocent of these charges, maybe we can get into counseling. Maybe we can get into marriage therapy and we can make this work again. But after his conviction, she's like, you're out of there, buddy. She filed for divorce and it was done. October 10th, Hackensack, New Jersey, Susan Geiger, raped and attempted to kill. She was pregnant at the time. She was also a prostitute. So, did she know she was pregnant? I'm guessing probably not. If I had to guess, I'd say probably not, or at least not to the point where she was showing and it would have affected her work as a prostitute. But you have to wonder if that might have been some kind of turn on for him. Uh, who knows? But Schilt and Geiger were horrifically assaulted, mutilated, slashed with knives. So you have to wonder why. Okay. So now we're going to get to his namesake, the Times Square Torso Ripper, the New York Ripper, Times Square Killer. He's got all these different monikers. Before I get to that, I want to tell you all a story. So when I first started getting really into true crime and wanting to understand criminal profiling, I read a book by Peter Vronsky, PhD. Now, Peter Vronsky actually started out as a production assistant in television and movies. And it was his job to take film stock from Canada, fly to New York, have the film processed, and then come back. And he'd spend his weekends in New York. For a 20-year-old, for a young 20-year-old, this is the greatest gig in the world. So he learned to be real frugal with his money and time because anything he didn't spend, he got to keep. Well, Murphy's Law happened, and there was some kind of snafu at the processing plant. So he ended up having to stay an extra day, a day he was not prepared for, didn't have the money for. So he looked around for the cheapest hotel room he could find, and he walks into this Travel Lodge Motor Inn on 47th Street, which is part of what was known in New York at the time as the 40 Deuce. Okay, and that's the Times Square area that at the time was just like the seediest place in the world. Peep shows, strip clubs, porn shops, you name it. It was always happening there in this area. And it wasn't until a huge cleanup effort happened and pushed all those things out of that particular area that Times Square became a destination with, the Times Square ball dropping on New Year's Eve, and then, all the shopping and everything. So but that happened over a period of time. So Peter Vronsky shows up. The hotel's kind of clean. And he's like, all right, it's not bad for what it is. It's not the Marriott, it's not the Hilton, but it's not horrible. So Peter Vronsky goes to get on the elevator, and he's sitting here thinking, okay, this is taking forever. And when the elevator finally gets down to him, he notices this weird guy. White guy, looks like he's trying to disguise himself. He's got on some kind of weird, like, wig, and he's carrying a duffel bag in his hands. And Vronsky states that Cottingham just walks right by him, bumps him with his bag, and Vronsky's like, "Wow, you're a complete jerk." But it's New York, so you don't really think anything about it. So he gets on the elevator, goes up to the floor, just kind of take a look around, see what he can see. Well, he starts to notice that there's these fine black flakes in the air. So he grabs a hold of one and he smears it in his hands. Well, it's not too long after that the fire alarms go off. So he evacuates the hotel and he's like, you know what? Cancel my reservation. I'm going to go anywhere else but here. So it wasn't until the next day when two bodies are discovered in one of the hotel rooms. Two bodies. And Peter Vronsky is sitting here, is like, oh man, that's a shame. So what happened? Murder, suicide? Well, according to the news report, when firefighters valiantly entered the room to put out the inferno, which is exactly how they described it, one of the firefighters pulled one of the bodies off of the bed out into the hall and attempted CPR, which he found to be incredibly difficult because the head was gone. So it wasn't until about 6 months later when Cottingham was arrested, Peter Vronsky looked at him and recognized the guy right off the bat. But then he thought about, wait a minute, they never found the head and the hands. He got off the elevator, he was carrying a duffel bag, and it felt like two bowling balls had brushed up against my leg. Yeah. So that was his first encounter with a serial killer. His next came when he was interviewing in Russia after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and he happened to meet Andrei Chikatilo. And after that, he sort of became fascinated with true crime, with homicide, with serial killers, and he's actually he's a phenomenal writer. If you ever get the chance to read anything by his, by all means do it. He actually kind of set my trajectory, pointed me in the direction of the people who really understood this the best. But the two victims were Dita Gaddazi and an unidentified 16-year-old victim. The head and hands severed. The bodies tortured. I'd like to say that this was something new or different, but finding dead prostitutes in a hotel room, not really all that strange or unusual. Okay? But here is what's strange and unusual, and let's talk about this for just a second. Richard Cottingham stated that the reason he took the head and the hands was he didn't want these two individuals identified. Now, Dita Gaddazi is the mother of Jennifer Weiss. Okay, that's how she fits into all of this. So make of that what you will. But the other thing is this 16-year-old victim. Okay. Cottingham has no problem killing people that he's acquainted with. And generally, whenever the head and hands are removed, it is for identification purposes. But why is it that only Gadzari and this unidentified 16-year-old were decapitated and had their hands removed? I have a theory about that. So it's no secret, it came out that Gaddazi and Cottingham had actually known each other and had something of a friendly relationship. And she had been seen in his company on numerous occasions. What about the 16-year-old girl? A 16-year-old girl tells me that she is probably somebody that Cottingham knew. And I think if you were to go back far enough and you were to talk to people who knew Richard Cottingham during the time, I bet you could find a 15 to 18-year-old female that would fit the general description. Now, the police officers investigating this case did a fantastic job. Absolutely phenomenal. Because while they were trying to identify the 16-year-old, They found mannequins that fit the size clothes that she was wearing, and they put out these posters everywhere. They were in the newspaper, they were on street corners, they were in business windows, everywhere, trying to get somebody to identify the clothing. Okay. And just the fantastic amount of police work that went into solving this case it's just mind blowing. And DNA is wonderful, especially for solving cold cases. And matter of fact, that's how Richard Cottingham was tied to a bunch of these cases, was through DNA. But the over reliance on that technology keeps officers from doing the good gumshoe stuff, getting out there, pounding the pavement, looking for leads, talking to witnesses, going back through, re-interviewing. It's not, I've said it before, the general public are not the only ones taken in by the CSI effect. Cops fall prey to it too. And I think now more than ever, they want the cell phone, they want the DNA to do their job for them. And they've lost a lot of that. They've lost a lot of that tenacity to go out there and find the bad guy. So, Valerie Ann Street, May of 1980, is the next victim. Bit and cut her breast so bad that she almost lost a nipple. And matter of fact, bite marks were huge in this. And biting is not unusual for a sexual sadist. It's Ted Bundy, as a matter of fact, probably the most famous use of odontology, forensic odontology, to compare bite marks to a suspect and to marks on a victim. It has its detractors and it has its supporters, and I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm kind of case by case basis. I want to be able to see. I want to be able to see those imprints. The thing is when you bite into skin, it's pliable. It moves. So I don't know how accurate that is. I'm not a dentist. That's not my field of expertise. But I think if the impression is clear enough, I think they can testify with a reasonable degree of certainty that the bite marks from the mouth of the suspect and the bite mark on the victim are likely to have come from the same place. May 12th, Teaneck, New Jersey, Pamela Weisenfield. She was beaten repeatedly and sexually assaulted. Gene Rayner, 25, raped, repeatedly stabbed, tortured, fatally strangled. He burned and removed both of her breasts post-mortem. Now, you have to wonder if this escalation has anything to do with the deterioration of his marriage. When we talk about serial killers, the word stressor comes up. Something that is prompting action on the part of the offender or unsub, if you don't know who they are. You're looking for some kind of stressor. Loss of job, loss of child, loss of family member, loss of marriage. All of these things represent stability in life. So now, granted, Cottingham hasn't been that stable through his life as we've already seen. But as we've moved forward, when that facade of having it all, living the American dream, seems to be crumbling because his wife is getting ready to leave him, and he's going to have to account for where he is at all hours of the night. Where's that money going? All of these things, the cat's going to come out of the bag, and that can create a stress that tends to have the offender escalate. Now, we've all heard that what goes up must come down. All right. So if an offender has an escalation, they are going to hit a point where they start to do what's called devolve. And when I say devolve, they start to lose control. They become sloppy. This is not a lot of people confuse a devolving serial killer with somebody who wants to get caught. It's not about wanting to get caught. In fact, John Douglas said that the only two people he could ever think of that actually had a desire to get caught were William Hirons and Ed Kemper. When after Ed Kemper killed his mother and her best friend, fled to Colorado, stopped in Pueblo, hid out in a telephone booth, called Santa Cruz and said, "Hey, I just killed my mom and her friend. Y'all should probably send somebody to come get me." But that really wasn't a desire to get caught. It was more. He was just done. He was just done. He's burned out. Keeping up this dual life takes a toll. For Richard Cottingham, it wasn't any different. Okay, but in his case, as the violence became more increased, as his personal life started falling apart, his career as a serial killer, he started taking more risk. He started taking fewer precautions, and everything started to fall apart for him. So now we come to the scream that ended the terror. All right. So Hossbrook Heights, New Jersey, Leslie Ann Odell, the last known victim of Richard Cottingham. The story goes, Odell had only been in New York a very short period of time, but she was already getting turned out by pimps. She didn't really have any money, nowhere else to go. Serial killers are amazing profilers in their own right. Just as a good profiler can spot a serial killer, serial killers have this knack for pointing out somebody who's weak, lost, damaged, and just willing to sacrifice some semblance of safety to feel needed, wanted, protected, what have you. Now, apparently her experience in New York was not a good one. Shocker. Especially given the news today, it doesn't appear to have gotten much better. But Odell runs into Cottingham. He ends up buying her dinner, talking to her. Hey, you know what? You're such a nice girl. You know what? What are you doing out here? Why are you doing this? You shouldn't be out here. It's dangerous for a girl like you. Go back home. Go back home to your family. You know what? I'll even get you there. But you know what? Kind of lonely. I'm going through a divorce right now. Would you come back to my hotel room? And you know what? If you do, you know, I'll pay you, but you know what? Let me give you a massage because you look like you could use it. She's going to go home to her family. Awesome. You know what? She made a mistake. She realized it. She's 18. She's not nearly as grown up and ready for the real world, especially. Get dropped off at a New York City bus stop. Man, that's reality crashes into you. Takes her back to a hotel room at a hotel that he has frequented before and where victims of his have been found. So he gets her undressed, straddles her back, getting ready to give her a nice little massage. All of a sudden, out come the handcuffs, knife to the throat, and he begins to sadistically attack her, slashing her, biting her, forcing her to do unspeakable things and doing unspeakable things to her. Several times during the assault, she actually passed out and woke up to Cottingham taking a cool washcloth and pushing it across her face and head, wiping her body down, trying to cool her off. A lot of people would interpret that as a form of empathy. Explain something to you about sadistic serial killers. In order to be a sadistic serial killer, you really have no empathy. Okay? In order to be a sadist, your pleasure is completely derived from the suffering and humiliation of others. Okay? You don't care. The fact that he was doing something that most people would consider a gentle, loving gesture was actually his way, was actually cruel because he was actually prolonging it. Because once a victim of a sexual sadist passes out or dies, there's really nothing there. They can't get a reaction out of a corpse. So the sexual sadist loses interest in the victim very soon after. And that's why mutilation is common, because they want to embarrass, they want to humiliate, they want to degrade the victim, but they also know somebody's coming to find that body. And what a coup would it be to see that big, tough, strong policeman walk through the door and be greeted by a head sitting on the mantle looking at them, or a pair of breasts sitting on the nightstand that obviously belonged to this young woman. Okay? Sexual sadists don't care. Finally, something happens and she screams. And this scream is so loud and so blood-curdlingly violent, like nothing any of the hotel staff had ever heard before. So call the police. Luckily, there happened to be a car in the area. They get to the door. They subdue Cottingham, and they see what's going on. And one of the officers just looks at him and said, "Dude, what in the world?" His answer, quoted verbatim, "I have a problem with women." You don't say. Problem with women, problem with boundaries. Yeah, you got more issues than Sports Illustrated there, bud. So he's arrested for the assault, torture, rape, sodomy that he perpetrated on Leslie Odell. I would be the first person to tell you, as an investigator, if you called me up for advice and you said that you came across a case like this, I would say you need to put together a task force. This is not this guy's first rodeo. No way, no how. This is an escalation of behavior. This is not where somebody starts. So, looking back, apparently the police did just that. So they started trying to create a paper trail, or any kind of trail, looking for Richard Cottingham. And so they did a handwriting analysis of ledgers that he signed into at hotels, receipts that he had signed. They compared that with personal handwriting samples from his home, from his work. They got him. Graphology is an amazing tool. I don't know that I believe that. I'm probably going to eat my words on this eventually, but I don't believe graphology is such a refined science that a graphologist can look at somebody's handwriting and tell if they're under duress, if they're stressed, if they're happy, sad, angry, sexually frustrated, whatever mind game they think they can have. I don't know if I believe personality can be determined from handwriting. Now, there's probably graphologists out there who would prove me wrong, and you know what? I would love to see a sample of that, just because I think it's fascinating. But above and beyond all that, just being able to look at samples of somebody's handwriting and be able to say with any degree of certainty that the handwriting matches or doesn't matches or is inconclusive. Graphology was used in the JonBenet Ramsey case for the members of the Ramsey household. Very interesting field. Forensically, it has a lot of possibilities, and I'd love to know more about it. I think handwriting analysis is absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that kind of put Richard Cottingham or started compounding his charges was on one of his victims, he got sloppy. And he had placed handcuffs on one of his victims. And this normally meticulous, procedure following serial killer made the ultimate boo boo. That ultimate boo boo was the handcuffs that he chose to use. These are mine that I carried as a police officer. These are not Richard Cottingham's hand restraints. I am not a supporter of murderabilia. I would love wanted posters, mugshots of these guys, but as far as anything else, I don't want anything that's ever belonged to them. But a fingerprint was found on this part of the handcuff that matched Richard Cottingham. It's called the ratchet. And that was one of the most damning pieces of evidence that that the prosecution used. They had an FBI expert come in and talk about that specifically, talk about that fingerprint and how it was left and how Richard Cottingham would have had to be holding the hand restraints, how the victim would have had to be positioned. Fingerprint analysis, you talk about detail-oriented and meticulous. Wow, that is a phenomenal skill. Okay, so 1981, Cottingham's convicted. Wife says, "See ya, I'm out. Don't call me, I'll call you, and don't wait by the phone." So 16 confirmed victims. Cottingham claims 80 to 100 total. Now, he's been on something of a confession streak over about the last 5 years. And while some of his confessions have yielded some pay dirt, most of them have fallen short of expectations. Back in the beginning of this video, I said that Cottingham stated that he had began killing in his adolescence. And maybe we can call 20 adolescence late adolescence. I don't know. But beyond that, there's certain behaviors that I would expect in his past. I would expect window peeping. I would expect inappropriate touching. And I would expect that he would engage in fetish burglary. Stealing women's undergarments off of laundry lines, breaking into their houses, touching their stuff, their intimate apparel, maybe laying in their bed, things like that. There's nothing known about that, but that type of behavior would be consistent with a budding sexual sadist. Like I said, there's not really anything known about that, and at the time, these types of behaviors may have been unprosecutable, or maybe law enforcement didn't take them seriously. There's not really a whole lot about him, okay? So, y'all, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it if you didn't know anything about Richard Cottingham and you want to learn more about him, there's a lot of stuff on him. Netflix has a really cool documentary about him right now. If you did know about Richard Cottingham, I hope it kind of shaped him in a different light, where maybe you kind of have a little more scholarly understanding of the development of a serial killer. Y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, please like and subscribe. Send this to your friends and your fellow true crime junkies. And by all means, please share the link to this video on your favorite social media apps. Y'all stay safe. We'll see you for the next Saturday with serial killers. Take care.